Hello everyone. Welcome to lecture 9.1, Cognitive Constraints on Music Perception. So before we're talking about what are the cognitive constraints on music perception, let's look into one example. This example is on serial music. Serialism is a compositional technique in the post-tonal era that were introduced in our previous lecture. Bollet's Le Marteau was widely hailed as a masterpiece of post-war serialism. Yet nobody could figure out, much less hear, how the piece was serial. From hints in Bollet's, Kobliakov at last determined that it was indeed serial, though in an idiosyncratic way. Listeners made what sense they could of the piece in ways unrelated to its construction. Comprehension takes place when the perceiver is able to assign a precise mental representation to what is perceived. Comprehension requires a degree of ecological fit between the stimulus and the mental capacities of the perceiver. So the problem is, although Bolet's intended his composition as a serial music using the 12-tone serialism, and also Kobliakov also determined that by investigating the compositional rules that this piece is indeed serial, but the perceiver, the listeners, don't perceive it as such. So the listeners make sense of the piece in ways actually unrelated to the compositional rules. So they follow another set of rules that's encoded by themselves to perceive the auditory stimulus. So the comprehension of the audience takes place when they when they are able to assign precise mental representations to what is perceived. So if they cannot assign such a precise mental representation, this might result in that they cannot comprehend or understand what is going on, or they would opt to a simpler or not precise mental representation for the piece they hear. Experienced listeners do not find Le Marteau totally incomprehensible, but neither do they assign to it a detailed mental representation. This is why the details of the piece are hard to learn and why the piece does not, in the end, feel complex. The serial organization that Kobliakov found is opaque to such structuring. So the serial organization is not the way how the listeners structure the composition. It's not the way they encode the piece, they comprehend the piece. So when they try to assign or try to comprehend the composition and construct the mental representation of the piece, because of this discrepancy between the compositional rule and the rules the audience follow, they fail to assign such a detailed representation. Therefore, they opt to a simpler representation that eliminated the nuances and details intended by the composer, which is why the piece finally was understood in a much simpler way than the aesthetics of the composer. A musician of Bollett's caliber would not use a compositional system without drawing crucially upon his musical intuition and experience. Music generating algorithms alone have always produced primitive outputs. He then shaped his material more or less intuitively, using both his ear and various unacknowledged constraints. In so doing, he listened much as another listener might. So, although this piece is uses the 12-tone serialism, but the composer himself does not take the tone role. That does not like merely take the tone role as the composition. Of course, he post processes the music or the composition by this algorithm, by these mathematical rules, and added his own musical intuition and experience, his own cognitive constraints upon the composition. So the organization deciphered by Kobliakov were just a means and not the only one towards an artistic end. The degree to which Le Marteau is comprehensible then depends not on its serial organization, but on what the composer added to that organization. The serial procedures profoundly influenced the stimulus structure, leading to a situation in which the listener cannot form a detailed mental representation of the music. The result is a piece that sounds partly patterned and partly stochastic. So we already explained why the listeners fail to assign a detailed mental representation to the stereo music, and also when they are trying to decipher the musical surface, they only understand part of it while ignoring maybe the nuances and details, or they misinterpret certain parts of the music, which make their mental representation partly patterned and partly stochastic. So in analyzing this example, we can more or less decipher that there are actually two sets of rules or two sets of grammars at work here. So this example is drawn from the paper Cognitive Constraints on Compositional System, written by Fred Ledau, who is also one of the composers of GTTM, Generative Theory of Tonal Music. So our discussion of Le Marteau suggests that there are two kinds of musical grammar at work here. The first is the compositional grammar, consciously employed by Bollett, that generated both the events of the piece and their serial organization. The second kind is the listening grammar, more or less unconsciously employed by authors, that generates mental representations of the music. So here is a figure that illustrates the compositional grammar using A and the listener's grammar in figure B. So the compositional grammar, the composer actually composes, or they creates a sequence of events based on the set of rules that's specified by their compositional thoughts, their musical intuitions, and the rules they follow. And in terms of the listening grammar, the listeners decipher a structural description in their as their mental representation from the sequence of events from the musical surface using another set of rules that's specified by the listeners, by the audience's understanding or their training of listening to music, which is constrained by their taste, their appreciation, and their cognitive um, systems. So so these are two different set of rules that apply to different groups of people. But here we can more or less feel that this listener's grammar is more or less a kind of inversion of the composer's grammar. So when the composer composes something from the rule to the music surface, the listener is doing the process inversely. So from musical surface, they would encode or it would construct the rules and the mental representations. So these two processes are kind of the reverse or the inverse of each other. So to combine the two approaches, two processes together into one theory, now we introduce another theory called implication realization. So this implication realization model was developed by Eugene Nummer as an alternative to Shankering analysis, which sketched ideas for a new model of analysis based on musical expectation and Gestalt principles. Completion, closure, good continuation, proximity, etc., as informed by the work of Leonard Meyer, which was introduced in lecture 5. So Nummer presents the implication realization theory of music cognition, which, like GTTM, is intended to be general, although the initial presentation was restricted to melody. So in the initial presentation, here are two books by Eugene Nummer, which is the analysis and cognition of basic melodic structures, and the analysis and cognition of melodic complexities. So these two books, published in 1990s, are basically through the discussion and presentation of musical melodies to introduce the embryonic idea of implication and realization theory. So so this theory is intended to be general as the GTTM to account for the general phenomenon of musical cognition and perception. But in contrast, this theory starts with a dynamic process involved the perceiving music in time. So this theory can be considered as a combination of Shankering analysis or GTTM, which features a bottom-up hierarchical musical analysis framework and combining the musical expectations and Gestalt principles that's developed by Leonard Meyer. So this model tries to combine the two aspects into one unified theory to account for music understanding and perception. This theory posits two distinct perceptual systems, which are considered as sources of implication and realization. The bottom-up system, or BU system, is argued as hardwired, innate, and universal, mechanistic, automatic, and largely implicit, and it defines a function, like closure versus non-closure. Another process is the top-down system, or TD system, which is learned through a musical experience, stylistically flexible, cognitively learned, and stylistically explicit, which tracks form, similarity versus differentiation. So we're not going to give detailed explanations about what are these terms and what they mean, like specifically, because they are drawn from these melodic discussions which touches upon a lot of the music theories and the musical terminologies. But generally speaking, in general, this theory incorporates two types of processing, the top down or the bottom up system and the top down system. So this makes possible interactions between two different types of implications. The two systems may conflict, and in any given situation, one may override the implications generated by the other. The IR model, implication realization model, hypothesizes that post-sensory signals are encoded in a primary BU system, which extracts events according to separate parameters, such as pitch sets, contours, consonances and dissonances, timbres, durations, meters, etc. So these explanations are actually quoted from a paper of Eugene Nummer. So these are the explanations, the illustrations by the author himself. So in 2014, when this theory is developed for like 15 years, this is his reflection on his implication realization theory. So secondary BU processing then operates on these primitives according to Gestalt principles, creating coherent implications and realizations for higher level syntactic analysis. So from this parsing, primary top-down processing subsequently identifies modes, scale step functions, chord types, metric hierarchies, and other such pre-primed information. The top-down system likewise activates a secondary level that relies on mapping previously learned, hierarchically complex, time-ordered schematic expectations, such as voice leading, harmonic processes, tonal strategies, formal constancies, etc. So in short, the bottom-up system is essentially a servo mechanism that enables the top-down system to access stylistic norms of implications and realizations, whether conditioned, habituated, or associated. So the explanation here might seem arcane to you if you don't understand how music perception works, and also some music theory terms. But the idea is that by illustrating how the bottom-up system interact with the top-down systems, how they coordinate with each other, here we aim to form an vague or a rough understanding of how the system works and how the musical expectation plays a role in the process of music perception. Fed back to the BU system, TD levels of complexity channel our attention to implicative input that deviates from explicit mapping. When the auditory world is as we expected, the BU system runs unconsciously in the background. So it means that when we are performing these musical expectations through the top-down system, so it channels our attention. So our expectations channel our attention to implicative input that deviates from explicit mapping. But so this is in the context if our expectation doesn't conform to the sensory input or the music we listen to. However, if the musical world, if the auditory world is exactly as what we expect, the BU system, the bottom-up system, actually runs unconsciously in the background. So this is another formulation of the tendency. So when the tendency is automatically, the tendency automatically processes without any inhibition or obstacles, everything like runs as it is and unconsciously in the background. Bifocal operations such as this minimize implicative error. Feed-forward causes the higher level system to hunt consciously for conformance in order to invoke the most statistically relevant schema. While feedback frees up lower level systems to abstract novel or nuanced auditory information. Neither system overrides the other, since novelty must always be learned, updated, and transformed into higher level memory. Likewise, top-down schema must remain attuned to redundant input, which statistically codifies or rejuvenates old memory in order to anticipate complexities apt to recur in upcoming contexts. So this gives a more detailed explanation of the relationship of the top-down and the bottom-up processes. So the feed-forward processing is the bottom-up process. It continuously hunts for the conformance at a higher level. And the top-down process in the feedback actually provides this musical expectation and information to lower levels and frees the lower levels, the lower layers in the bottom-up processing of the nuanced auditory information. So the description here might seem abstract, but we're going to decipher it in our next lecture in a more systematic way, using a concept, a very important cognitive mechanism called predictive processing in neurobiology, to systematically and theoretically describe this phenomenon from this cognitive science perspective. Because here, Eugene Nummer, he is a musical theorist or a musical scholar. He's not very familiar with the brain mechanisms and the modern kind of theories in this neuroscience. So he's describing this system using his own words, his own ways, might be kind of involved and intertwined here. But these ideas will be further clarified in our next lecture. significant mismatches between what was implied vis-a-vis what was realized produce field arousal and tension. So it also accounts for the sources of tension and and the musical emotions, which is resulted from a mismatch between what was implied and what was realized. In the bottom-up system, sequences of melodic intervals vary in the degree of closure that they convey. So here, the discussion is more focused on the melodic on the melodic description of this theory. So it's more like onto the ground, and by analyzing how the melodic behavior, we try to understand the IR theory through this musical scenario. So in the bottom-up system, sequences of melodic intervals vary in the degree of closure that they convey. And strong closure signifies the termination of ongoing melodic structure. So I believe this also more or less related to the Emotion and Meaning, the book by Leonard Meyer, in terms of completion and closure, and also the weakening of shape. This kind of weak closure or non-closure versus a strong closure. An interval which is unclosed is said to be an implicative interval and generates expectations for the following interval, termed the realized interval. So here, it gives us like the reason, the meaning of the name of this theory, right? Implication realization. So what is implication and what is realization? An interval which is unclosed is said to be an implicative interval, and it generates expectations for the following interval, which is termed the realized interval. The expectations generated by implicative intervals for realized intervals are described by Naumer in terms of several principles of continuation, which are influenced by the Gestalt principles of proximity, similarity, and good continuation. So we can see that this part of theory is mostly drawn from Leonard Meyer's work in the Emotion and Meaning of Music. The IR model also specifies how the basic melodic structures combine together to form longer and more complex structural patterns of melodic implication within the IR theory. In particular, structures associated with weak closure may be chained to subsequent structures. So the structure with weak closure, which means it's more or less like it is not closed, which can be continued, can be brought brought into the next musical phrase. In addition, structural tones, those beginning or ending a melodic structure, combination or chain, which are emphasized by strong closure at one level, are said to transform to the higher level. So we can see that in this part, in this paragraph, it's more refers to the GTTM, the generative theory of tonal music, the hierarchical processing of the musical surface, which involves a hierarchy or reduction of the musical surface by assigning different structural importance to different musical phrases. So here it assigns the musical phrase as closure and non-closure, and also the musical phrases can be combined into longer or bigger like musical structures. Into longer or more complex musical structural patterns, and also the strong closures can at one level can be transformed to a higher level. So here it features this hierarchy, this thought of hierarchy and transformation, because the strong closure at one level can be considered as a weak closure at a higher level. So this is how the music surface is structured as this parsing tree and using this hierarchical analysis framework. So this is all for this lecture. We introduced two types of theories. One is the listener and the compositional grammar, and the other is implication realization theory. And in our next lecture, we are going to give a more systematic introduction to these bottom-up and top-down processes named predictive processing.